This will be a deep look at particles, visual effects, and writing on effects. So we're going to take a quick look at what we're working on. I'm going to start by organizing my project. I already imported the footage, but I'm going to re-import it to show you how I did that. To create the folder, I just clicked on the new folder button down here. So to bring in your footage, you go File, Import File, and I'm going to make a new composition. If I drag it directly onto the new composition, it automatically makes a new composition that's the correct aspect ratio, frame rate, and duration. It perfectly matches up with the clip. And what I'd done was I pieced it together in Adobe Premiere. And when it got to a point in between the different effects, I added black frames. I just didn't have the clips meet up, so I knew where to edit. Now to go back one frame, you hit the page up button on your keyboard. To go forward one frame, you hit the page down. And that's how you can precisely find the frame you want to cut at. With the layer selected, you press Control-Shift-D or Command-Shift-D based upon Mac or PC, and it will split the layer. So another way of doing that is Edit, Split Layer, and it'll split where the playhead is. So now I go forward a few frames, and that's where the next effect starts. So I do the same thing with the layer selected, Edit, Split Layer, or Control-Shift-D or Command-Shift-D. And there's the split, and I just delete that, and there's my next clip. So that's how I got started. And here's all my different effects that we'll be working with. We're going to start by taking a very deep look at CC Particle World in Adobe After Effects. Later on, we're going to deal with effects that have that hand-drawn-on look. And we're going to do one with shape layers and one with particles. And I'll show you why it's a good idea to know how to do both of them. So to begin, we're going to need a new solid. I could right-click in an empty space in my timeline down here and choose New Solid. Or I can go up to the top, Layer, but I have to have my timeline selected. See, right now it's got the project selected. If I click in here, you see the blue line move to the timeline. There's the blue line at the project and the composition. I want it down here. My timeline is selected. Now I can go Layer, New, Solid. And I will name this Particles. And I'm just going to make it black just to make things easier. You could always hit Make Comp Size. I'm working at 4K. And I'll hit OK. And here's my particles. Now they're at the top of my layer stack. I'm just going to move them to directly above the clip I want. So you'll see this layer goes along here. And if I scroll past it, this one is on top. So you always see what's on top of your layer stack. To find Particle World, you just go to Effects and Presets. And you choose Type in Particle. And you get Particle World. You could drag it onto the layer, or with the layer selected, you could double click on the effect, and there we have it. What it had done was it removed the solid of the layer, and we're just seeing the effect. So I'm going to solo the effect. I did that by clicking the solo for that layer right here. That's how you turn it on and off. It's right next to the lock, and the eyeball icon will hide the layer. There's also Shy if I wanted to shy the layer. What I would need to do is first I'd click Enable Shy up here at the top. Then when I shy the layer that I want, it disappears from view. It's still in my project. So to re-see it, I click on the Shy again up there, and now I see it. If you've got audio, make sure you mute the audio before you shy things if you don't want to be heard. Same with video. If it's not hidden with the eyeball and the sound icons, when you shy it, it will appear in your render, so just be careful of that. So I'm going to solo my layer. Later on in the video, we're going to be talking about the floor and collisions. First thing you need to know is birth rate. That's basically how many particles are being born per second. So if I increase the number to 60, you're going to see a lot more particles. So I'm going to drop that down to 1. Longevity is how long each particle is born. So if I have them last for 10 seconds, less will be coming out because they're living longer. If I have them last for a quarter of a second, they'll be coming out more frequently. And you just hit the spacebar to preview it. If your computer's running slow, you can always change your preview resolution right here. You can even create a custom resolution by clicking custom, then typing in the number of pixels you'll be seeing. So it's render 1 pixel for every 20 pixels. So that's an even more drastic if you're dealing with a lot of intense graphics. Next, we've got the producer. X will be side to side, the x-axis will be side to side, y will be up and down, and z will be closer and further from the camera. So I could slide the numbers like that. I'm just sliding with inside the mouse, or you could type in something more specific to move it an exact amount. And there's y for up and down, and z back and forth to the camera. Radius is how wide or narrow the effect will be going, and you could change it, like I said, x side to side, y up and down, z closer and further away from the camera. So that's your basic producer settings. Next we've got physics, and these are default settings based upon what type of animation you want to do. If you want it to explode out, or if you want it to go upwards like fire, you see how the different physics affect the particles. I always use the way Harry Frank defines particles. A particle basically is born onto the screen, does something, and then it dies and goes away. Unless you're using a third-party plugin where the particles don't live or die, they're just constantly there. When you're working with particles, first you worry about the motion, how they're moving, then you worry about how they look. And I'll explain that in a moment. So if I want this to be more of an explosion, or say I was doing a tornado, I'd want the vortex for the physics. We'll just stick with explosive for now. So first we're going to get the motion of the particles the way we want, then we'll worry about how they look. Velocity shows how fast and far apart they are moving out of the producer. You could even have negative velocity. If you want to do the draw-on effects, which we'll talk about later, you're going to want 0 velocity, but I'm going to do this just so you can see it. I'll create some velocity for it. Gravity. Negative gravity will have the particles float upward as if they're lighter than air. Positive gravity will pull them downwards. And don't forget, anything in After Effects that has a stopwatch, you can click on the stopwatch and then move your playhead in time to wherever you want or however long you want it to take place, and then change it. So I can have the particles. I'm going to press the U key to see my keyframes. I keyframe the gravity and they go from downward to upward. When you click on the stopwatch, it will remove your keyframing. And if you want to select all your keyframes, you could just click on the word, not the stopwatch, but the word, and it's selected all of those keyframes in the gravity if you don't feel like doing a marquee click around it. I'm going to get rid of that keyframing. Resistance is how much they're resisting the physics engine that's going on. So I'm going to hit the space bar, and you see the particles shooting outward. If I increase the resistance, they're not going out as far, but they're still keeping the direction of the physics engine. So that's one way to tame your effect if it's going a little too wild. Change your resistance settings. Extra will randomize the particles a bit more. This is useful for when you're using like video clips and things of that nature. And you can also change the angle of it should you want to. Floor we'll be getting into later on, but you can have the particles react with a floor. And when I change the position of the floor, you see the grid move up. And when the particles meet the floor, once they hit the floor, I chose an ice effect. And you see now they're sliding across the floor as if it were ice. There's ice, glue, where if you choose ice, they'll slide across the floor. If you choose glue, they'll hit the floor and stay there, sort of like if you spilled salt. So that's how they do that with those type of logo animations. Bounce, they will bounce back. And we'll be going deeper into this later on in the tutorial. Direction access, you can change the direction of the floor. Particle. This is the important part, because I said first you get the particles moving how you want them to, then you worry about how they look. So before we go to particle, we're going to talk about extras. I'm going to add a camera to my scene. I go layer, new, camera. I'm going to change this to, let's say, 80 millimeter. Only because I'm going to change this to 80 millimeter just because I want a more pronounced bokeh when I enable the depth of field. And the camera is right up here at the tool. You've got orbit, track, and zoom. You could also toggle between those by hitting the C key on your keyboard. Particle World is the only 3D particle system in After Effects. So you could match your effects up to the shot using the grid that we used earlier, and then your camera. Effect camera, you can change how your particles are coming out based upon that. Also with depth cue, and you could fade them over a certain distance. There's also hold particles. This is important if you want a quick burst of particles to come out. So I'm going to select my layer. I'm going to click there. I'm going to go forward. I'm going to change this to 100%. No particles are coming out. I'm going to go forward 1 frame, and I'll change that to 0. Now we have an instant burst of particles. That's how you do that. Go press the U key, get rid of that just so you can see it. Random seed will randomize your particles, which is very useful to get a more organic look. Or if you duplicate a particle layer, you can change the random to make the effect look different. We'll be going into that later. Now we're going to talk about how the particles look. I'm going to zoom in a little bit so we can see them better. This is your line, which literally it is a line. You've got star, shaded sphere, faded sphere, which is useful. And obviously the names are pretty cut and dry. Okay, here's the important part. When you're going for custom particles, you'll be using the textures, and we'll be talking about that later. So I'm going to use faded sphere just for this example, because like I said, this is a super basic look. Then we're going to be getting more in depth. Birth size is how big they are at birth. Death size is how big they are at death. Birth is when they're born onto the screen, and then they'll do whatever. So what they're going to be doing when they come on the screen is whatever physics we chose, and we chose explosive. So I could have them be very large at birth, and then as they're on the screen and they die, they get smaller. So you can see these ones that are starting to die and those that are born, there's already a change in the size. I'm going to turn off my camera just to speed this up. You can change the size of the particles over life. You could also keyframe that along with the number of particles being born per second. Size variation. 100 is maximum size variation. You can already see how the particles got smaller and larger. If I change that to 0, they'll be uniform. So if I make these 0.5 and 0.5, they're staying the same size as they're born and as they're dying, and there's no size variation. So you see they're all the same. You could always randomize that, and that's how you do that. Maximum opacity. If I want these to be completely visible, I'll hit 100. But if I want them to be faded, which we'll go into with smoke and clouds and fog, I would change the maximum opacity. Opacity map. What this means is it's fading on and then it's fading off as it dies. If I want them to not fade off or on and I want them to just appear, I just draw on with the pen tool and I fill in the graph. Now they're not fading on or off, and you can already see that. If I want them to fade on but not off, I change my graph like such, and now they're going to fade on but not off. And you could do the opposite of that if you want. That's how you change. That's how you can create custom looks with your opacity of the particles. Color map, birth to death. That's as they're being born. You can change the color to whatever you want. I could have them be blue as they're born and then red as they're dying. And that automatically changes the color of them. You could also do custom color maps that are far more detailed about the life and death of them across time. And last but not least, we have the transfer mode. This is crucial. If you have it set to composite, they'll have volume where they stack up on top of each other. But if I do screen, you see they start blending with each other, and the particles will interact with each other completely differently. If I go to add, as they add over top of each other, they get even brighter. So with screen, they blend together and get a little bit brighter. With add, they blend together, and as the more they stack on top of each other, the brighter it's going to get. If it starts getting too hot with your brightness, change the maximum opacity to fix that. So if I wanted particles that were dense and not see-through, I'd use composite. But for light effects or things that have lightness to them, like fire, you'd use screen or add, and then it'll also help them blend into the scene. So that's an introductory look at particles. Now I'm going to show you one of the flaws with this system and the workaround for it. I'm going to turn off solo, and I'm going to zoom out. Now you see right away that my particles are not lining up with the wand tip and where I want them. And what I'm doing here is I'm going to hide the particles, and I hit the spacebar to preview the video. I'm just moving the wand from side to side, and I'm doing that for a reason. I'm going to show you what the motion path does. I have it turned on here with my guide, so you'll quickly see how you'll run into problems with your default producer and the motion path. I'm going to move my playhead back. I can always start moving the frame to line it up, and I can use my arrow if I want. And roughly I have the producer right where the wand tip is. I can click the stopwatches for X, Y, and Z, And should I choose to, I could go frame by frame or loosely eyeball it. I'll press the U key. You see my particles getting keyframed as I move the producer. That's one way of doing it. It's going to be slow and boring. Another way you can do it is to motion track this. To enable motion tracking, I double click on the clip and it opens up in its own window in my composition panel. I then select my clip, right click, and choose Track Motion. And I get my motion tracking panel open up. Only one point is moving. This isn't a 3D effect. This is just going side to side. So I'm going to recreate that initial thing without motion tracking. I'm going to go back here, and again, I'll show you what happens. So I've got my particles, and the keyframe is on, and I'll just move forward in time, and then I move them. Now you see this motion path. It's linear. It's not Bezier curved, so you're not going to get smooth organic looks. That's the default motion path when you're animating the producer. It's linear. It's not Bezier or curved. So I'm going to undo that. I just wanted to show you what happens. I'm going to track this, and then I'm going to show you how to parent the producer to a null. And the reason for that is the null will have a Bezier curve path, and you'll get a smoother, more organic motion, and the particles will follow the null, rather than using the default motion path I showed you. And you're going to want this move arrow, the black arrow. Watch what happens. If I don't have that, if I don't have the black arrow, it's going to move the track points, which is not what I want. I want the move arrow. You'll need to be zoomed in a little bit just so that, see, I'm going to choose this point right here because, actually I'll choose right here. You want to have a nice sharp point that's in focus when you're tracking. Next, I'm going to choose Analyze Forward, and I'm going to stop it every once in a while just in case this track point goes off. Again, I only need the one point because it's a simple track. You see it's already off. So I'm going to hit undo. Since After Effects was unable to motion track this, we're going to create a null and keyframe the null following this and then link the particles to it. So I go Layer, New, Null. And a null object is basically an invisible object that won't render that you could use as a reference point for motion tracking and camera movements. Now, since Particle World is 3D X, Y, and Z, I'm going to need to 3D enable this null. So I click on the layer and I choose the switch for 3D enable. Now I've got a gizmo. If I hover over the green arrow, you'll see the Y. That means that's the Y axis up and down. If I hover over the X, it'll constrict the movement to just side to side. Same with Y, up and down. And Z will be closer and further from the camera. So I'm just hovering over those gizmo points until I see the axis change. And I'm also going to move my anchor point so that it's in the center of the null. I'm using my pan behind. If I hold down Control or Command, it'll snap it to edges, corners, or the middle. So now my anchor point is at the center of the null. And this will just help me with the producer a little bit easier. It's just for my own sake. So I've got my anchor point at the center, and I've got the center point resting at the tip of the wand. And I click the stopwatch for position, and I move forward a little bit. And then I keep moving forward. You can zoom in and zoom out of your timeline using this slider right here. Now, as you can see, my path, I can click on the points and edit the Bezier curve handles to get smoother, nicer motion should I choose to. That's one benefit of the null, is that you can smooth up the motion. And you see the null got a little bit ahead. So you preview your animation. I'm just scrubbing with the playhead and dragging it so that I can preview it faster. Now that I have the null following the motion, I'm going to parent the producer X, Y, and Z to the null, and you'll see the particles following this around. And once we get this concept done, then we're going to go into custom particles to actually get more aesthetically pleasing, useful motion graphics and visual effects looks with your particles. I'm going to start by clicking the stopwatches for X, Y, and Z, and then hitting the U key to go down here. I'm going to rename my null by right-clicking, and I called it Null VFX. I'm going to Alt or Option click on the stopwatch for position X for the producer. Grab my pick whip, connect it to the X axis of that, and this is the name of the null. So if you named your null something different, that's where you would change it if you need to. Copy this expression and paste it there. For my Y, I'm going to Alt or Option click on the stopwatch, pick whip it to the Y axis on my null, add the expression, and do the same for Z. Alt or Option click, pick whip to the Z, and then copy my expression. And I'd gotten this expression from Short Toots on YouTube, and here's the link to the video. Now you see as the null moves, the particles will follow it. And that's how you get your particles to follow a 3D null object, and you will also see you get a much smoother motion path where you can adjust the Bezier curves as you see fit or as you need to get better looking motion. We're going to start working on custom particles, and this is where the truly powerful part of Particle World comes in for motion graphics and visual effects. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new comp. I'll call this Smiley. I'll make it 300 by 300. You don't want to go really over 400 by 400 when you're making custom particles. They'll slow down the machine. And you always want to make sure it fits within the size of the comp. Okay, so I'm going to put that smiley face pre-comp in here now, and I'm going to hide it. And I'm going to go to my particle layer, my particle world layer, and I'm going to choose particle type, and I'm going to choose textured square. The textures down here are for your custom particles. So from textured square, I'm then going to choose my smiley, and I'm going to give it a composite instead of a screen. Maximum opacity 100 so we can see what's going on. Okay, now I chose this to demonstrate what scatter does. I'm going to increase the scatter right there. And you see it's pushing what's inside the particle around. So you can get this randomized look. You've got to be careful, because if you want to see the full image, then you might not want to do scatter. That's what scatter will do. So I'm going to get rid of that. And then next, what I'd done was I made a cloud pre-comp. This is a PNG of a cloud. I made it 300 by 300. And all I'd done was I put turbulent displace and a twirl effect on it. The twirl effect is animating from here. It's going up and down while the turbulent displace gives it some life. I'll go back to my particle layer, and I'm going to choose texture faded disk. And I'm going to go to my texture, and I'm going to choose cloud animated. So now you can see with the faded disk, the clouds are blending together very nicely, and I'm getting a very nice organic randomness to it because they're animated as opposed to a still image, so it helps scatter them around. Now, for the maximum opacity, if I want to look more like fog, or mist, I want a lower opacity, whereas if I wanted to have some density, like if it were fire, I would increase the opacity, and then I'd probably change the curves on it as well, if that's the look I was going for. And you could color it however you want. So that's an example of a still image that was animated to create a more realistic type of particle. I'm going to get rid of that. Now next, I'd imported some fire, and I put key light on it. So I'm going to reset that. So use the key light effect by typing into your effects for key light, choose your green, and you remove it. And this has to be pre-composed. You do it inside the pre-comp so that when it's rendered as a particle, it will... Okay, so my composition size inside the pre-comp is 400 by 400. And I'm going to shrink it down so that the whole thing fits inside of the composition. So here's my fire. Go move it down a little bit. Change the position a little. So it's definitely staying within there. It's pre-comped. So I'm going to go to my effect. Now for the smoke, I had a blending mode of composite because I didn't want it to blend together. I'm going to choose texture faded disk, and under texture, I'm going to choose fire, my pre-comp. Now, for this, I'm going to change the composite to screen, and you're going to see already that makes it look more realistic. And if I did add, it'd get even brighter. So if that's too hot, I would change the maximum opacity. So I could keep the birth size and the death size. Maybe I won't have it get so large. Like that. If I wanted to have it be the color of the footage, I make sure my birth and death size are white. But I could also get a little bit creative with it, where I could change the color of it over time. Should I choose to, if I want to give it a different type of feel. Now changing the blending mode on that in here will also help, making it screen or add for the whole layer. I'm going to stick with add for that, and then lower the opacity a little bit. That's an example of using video, and we did scatter with the smiley face, and then we got a PNG and we animated it. So I'm going to get rid of this, go back to line, and I'd made this shape layer. It's a circle that I gave a gradient fill to. I'll show you how I did that. So you gotta make sure nothing's selected, because if something is selected, then you'll create a mask, and that's not what you want. So here's the circle, and I do not want a stroke, so I click the word stroke and then choose none, and then I click the word fill and choose radial gradient like that. So that's how I created the gradient, and then I applied glow to it, and I gave it a cross blur just on the y-axis to give it that little bit of interest. And then I gave it an expression. For the opacity, I gave it this wiggle space parenthesis 19 comma 750. It's going to wiggle 19 times per second with an amount of 750. So that's for the opacity, to give it a flicker like that. You see it flickering already. And then the scale, I gave that an expression of wiggle 2 times per second, an amount of 40, so that when it had the scaling plus the glow, it did not go past the size of the sequence. And I called that my circle particle. So I'm going to hide that. In fact, I go back to my particle layer. I'm going to choose texture faded disk because I don't want hard edges. Instead of the fire, just choose my circle particle, I'll change the blending mode to screen, and I'll put the layer mode to screen. I'll color them both back to white. Okay. And that's a bit small, so I'm going to increase the birth size and the death size. Have to get a little bigger as it dies. And you can see how I created a custom particle off of that. So once you've got custom particles and you have them looking the way you want and moving the way you want, you could use them in your visual effects. So let me demonstrate. I'll call this, fix the opacity. There we go. I want this to have more opacity because it's a light effect and not be as large as it was. Okay, so I've got this natural looking effect going on just from that shape layer that I'd created. I'm going to duplicate this. Well, first I'm going to rename it. I'm going to call this flicker. And I'm going to save it, and I'm going to duplicate it by pressing Command D. So I'm going to keep my flicker effect. I'm going to duplicate it, rename it smoke. No. I'm going to hide the flicker, go back to the smoke, change the particle type, texture, to the animated cloud, change the blending mode back to composite, lower the opacity, and then turn the flicker back on. So now I'm going to do multiple layers of this to create one effect off of multiple particle systems. Now I'm going to duplicate the smoke. I'm going to call this fire new. I'm going to change the blending mode of the smoke to normal. There we go. I'm going to keep the fire and the flicker as screens because they're light effects. So I'm going to change on the fire. I'm going to use my fire pre-comp. See, I'd already recorded this, but I have to redo it because I lost the file. Let's change that death size and the birth size. And then I'll color the flicker effect. So now I've got 3 particle systems going on off of that one effect. This next part of the tutorial, I have a particle-based cloud system, which we'd worked on earlier, and I have that hidden being used for this adjustment layer. And the adjustment layer has CC glass, displacement map, and I turned off camera lens blur. But since I made this grayscale, I can use it in the mapping. So for CC glass, I chose the bump map and put it in there. And for displacement map, I put it in the displacement map. If I were to use it in the blur effect, it would go right in the layer right there. So this particle system is powering these effects. I then duplicated the particle system and I have it visible with the blending mode set to overlay. So I'll pause the effect here and I'll turn off the duplicate. And you can see how I'm using it to bring back some detail, and I set the opacity to 66%. So this is what the particle system looks like. As I said before, it's that still cloud that I animated, and what I'd done was I have it starting off larger, and then as it dies, it gets smaller with a fairly long life cycle. Well, not that long of a life. It actually isn't alive that long. Now, for the birth and death color, I have it getting a little darker as it's going along. And I set the opacity to not fully 100% with some size variation. Actually, let's see what happens if I crank that up to 100. And then I'm going to let this re-render. and you can see how the effect has changed. Since I pre-composed it, it affects both of them because it's the same effect. Now this is important. I'm going to open up the pre-comp. Inside the pre-comp, I've got my particles, the null that they're parented to, plus the camera, and the image that I used to create them. That's all pre-composed together so that none of the information gets lost. Because if I didn't have the null or the camera, it would mess up the expression for it following the path. Well, that's it for this tutorial. Hope everyone has a great Halloween, and I will be getting more into floors and particle systems in my next tutorial. So have a safe and happy Halloween.